Good evening, everybody, and welcome to P's and G's. Welcome, particularly if you're here for the first time. My name is Andy. I'm part of the team here at the church, and it's lovely to have you with us. It's great that you could come and join us. Whether you come to P's and G's, you've been coming for a long, long time, whether you go to a different church around the city, or whether you're just visiting and this is your first time in a church, we really, really hope you feel at home. David, for those who don't know, is a reverend professor. And he is the project lead on something called E-Class, which stands for Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. And we were talking about it earlier. Part of the mission of E-Class is to really give confidence and life to Christians in leadership in the area of science and the relationship between science and faith. David is also, in his spare time, a professor at the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. He has PhDs in astrophysics and systematic theology. He's a regular contributor to Radio 4's Thought for the Day, has lectured widely all over the world, has written a number of books. His most recent books include God, Stephen Hawking and the Multiverse, and another one which we have available, a small number of copies at the back, called How Does God Act in the World? So, with no further ado, can we thank David for being here?
Thank you very much, Andy, for the welcome, and thank you for being here. It's lovely to see so many folk here this evening, and it's a privilege to be here, and I've heard much about this particular church, and to be part of it for one evening is a delight. I was on a train a few years ago, and I was reminded of it when I came up from Durham today to Edinburgh, and the person beside me wanted to start a conversation, and they said, "What do you do?" Well, I said, I'm a theologian who works at Durham University. I'm also a Methodist minister. And now, you never quite know when you say that to people what people's reaction will be. And this man's eyes seemed to fill with fear as he thought to himself, "Oh no, I'm sitting beside a religious fanatic all the way to London." So he quickly tried to change the topic of conversation. He said, "What did you do before that?" Well, I said, "I did research in theoretical astrophysics." This time his eyes glazed. He thought to himself, what on earth does he mean by that? But he knew it was something to do with science. And so he asked me that question that lots of people have asked over the years. How can you be a scientist and a Christian? In fact, we live sometimes in a culture which puts science and faith rather into this cartoon. I don't know whether I'm speaking to this kind of audience this evening, or whether you want to reverse it and you're the guy in the Hawaiian shirt or whatever. But that image of conflict between science and religion, particularly in terms of the title that Andy very kindly chose out of the number of titles that I gave him to choose out of: Genesis, creation, artificial intelligence, the Big Bang. And people often see the two in conflict. Dara O'Brien, stand-up comedian, presenter of many panel shows, himself a background in astronomy. Well, this is a short clip, if it works, from his stand-up routine as he discusses Genesis and science. Well, my background is in theoretical astrophysics. You all know what theoretical astrophysics is, don't you? It's very easy. It's twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. That's basically astrophysics. The only trouble is that astrophysicists reply up above the world so high, a contracting ball of hot hydrogen gas undergoing nuclear fusion. It doesn't quite scan in the same way as a nursery rhyme. But I worked on the Big Bang, on galaxies, on star formation. And for me, there wasn't that conflict between science and faith, which is so regularly represented within the media. And I'm going to try and talk about that this evening. And I'm going to take the risk of going to the book of Genesis. Now, within the Christian church, I need to acknowledge that different Christians have different ways of reading the first chapter of Genesis. Some Christians believe it is a scientific textbook which tells the story of the world being created 6,000 years ago over 6 days. Other Christians equally committed to the authority of Scripture say that the intention of the writer is not to write a scientific text, it is a theological text about who God is. In fact, my own view is that the first chapter of Genesis is a hymn or a song. It's a praise song. And Andy, if you had the writer of Genesis here this evening, which would be a far more interesting prospect than me to give a talk, and you asked the writer of Genesis through using the code, how old is the universe? I suspect the writer of Genesis would say, to be honest, I'm not really interested in that. What I'm interested in is you know just how great God is, and I want you to get up and we're going to worship God together. That's what Genesis 1 is, a hymn. Now, as I say, Christians disagree on that, and within this room, those of you who are Christians will have different views on that. That's fine. We'll explore that when we get to the question time. But I am taken with those words you see from Galileo. The Scriptures are meant to tell us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. Galileo himself saw that there was a deeper meaning to Scripture than just a scientific textbook. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out from Genesis 1 a number of theological themes that you find whenever you poke a finger into Christian history. You'll find Christians agreeing on these fundamental understandings about God the Creator. Okay? I'm going to illustrate them from the book of Genesis, and it'll give me a way to then put into dialogue the science. Does that sound all right with everyone? Okay. One or two of you going, oh, it sounds a bit boring to me. Well, it is. No, it's not going to be boring. Okay, so first one is this, as we look at Genesis 1. And that is that God is the sole creator of the universe, Christians believe. So Genesis begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And for me to stand here and say, a fundamental truth that Christians believe is that God created the whole universe, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's obvious, isn't it? I mean, why have they brought this bloke all the way from Durham to talk to us and say that God is the sole creator? But it is so important that the writer of Genesis will come back to it a number of times in rather subtle ways. For example, God made the two great lights, Genesis 1 verse 16, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. What's the greater light and the lesser light here? What is it? Sun and moon. Have you ever thought why the writer didn't use the words sun and moon in Genesis? Well, probably the reason is that this is what's called theological polemic. It's the writer saying, you live in a culture in the ancient Near East where people believe in the sun god and the moon god. Actually, don't be so silly to believe that the sun and the moon are gods. They're simply the greater light and the lesser light created by the one true God. Theological polemic is saying to people, don't be so silly to believe that. Let me tell you what to believe, okay? And then you go a little further on. Those of you who have read Genesis 1, and it's an interesting chapter to read if you haven't. Verse 21, so God created the great creatures of the sea. Now, the word create there is used in the first verse of Genesis. God created the heavens and earth. And it's used later on in the chapter, God created human beings. The only third place that create is used is the great creatures of the sea. Now, that's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, you can understand why this special word for create is used for the whole universe. Understand why this special word for create is used just for human beings. But why the great creatures of the sea? Is God particularly interested in whales? I mean, of the sea type, not the country. I mean, is his favorite movie trilogy Free Willy? I mean, what's going on here? Well, again, if you know your stories of the ancient Near East, you'll know that in many stories of the ancient Near East, God has to overcome the great creatures of the sea before God creates. So the writer is saying, God is the sole creator, even if these great creatures of the sea exist. God created all of them. And if we had longer than the 4 hours that Andy's given me this evening, we could go on to talk about how also this theological polemic goes with he made the stars also, and he separates easily, he speaks and it is done, and these are poking at Egyptian creation myths as we go on. So Genesis is saying God is the sole creator of the universe. You say, just hold on a moment. You said you used to work on the Big Bang. Let's go into the Big Bang just for a little bit. Would that be all right? So 13.8 billion years ago, we think that the universe was small enough to fit through the eye of a needle. At that point, the universe begins to expand rapidly in what we call the Big Bang, leading to the Hubble expansion. In the next slide, I've tried to put the whole history of the universe on one slide. I'm really sorry about that. Here we are. Our present age is 13.8 billion years. Some of us feel that more than others at times. And our current models of physics are very good because they allow us to trace the universe back in its history. So we think we know what the universe was like when it was only 1 million years old. Those of you who are mathematicians, this is not to scale. We even think that our models of physics work pretty well to describe the universe back to 1 second old. And if that isn't sufficient, then most of us believe that our models of physics work pretty well back to 10 to the minus 43 of a second. That's 1 divided by 10 followed by 42 zeroths of a second. If you're an engineer or biologist or a normal person, if you know what I mean by that, you'll probably say that's 0, isn't it? Well, not quite. At that point, our current laws of physics break down, and it is extremely frustrating. It's as if you've been watching 5 hours of Midsummer Murders, and just before you get to the revelation of the murderer right at the end, your television breaks or your internet goes out. The really interesting part, the t equals 0, we can't quite get to. I'll come back to that in a moment. The universe is very small, a fraction of a centimeter across at 10 to the minus 43 of a second. As it expands, it cools. As it cools, the energy becomes matter. Between 1 second and 1,000 seconds, you get, in the visible matter in the universe, about 75% hydrogen, 25% helium, little bits of lithium and deuterium, but not enough to write home about. And then to cut a long story short, the vast clouds of hydrogen, particularly molecular hydrogen, forms stars and galaxies. And you might say, well, just hold on a moment, how do you know that's true? As the Lord said to Job in the Old Testament, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? You'll say the same thing to scientists. Well, of course, when it comes to cosmology, we're into a Miss Marple detective story. When Miss Marple appears on the scene of a crime, she hasn't seen the crime happen. What she does is look for clues or pieces of evidence to reconstruct the best model. And the Big Bang is our best model based on various bits of evidence like the microwave background and the abundance of helium, the expansion of the universe. We can get into those in more detail in a moment. But this model breaks down at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, and it is extremely frustrating. Do you want to know why it breaks down at 10 to the minus 43 of a second? Yes, I hear you cry in unison, which means we need to spend 30 seconds on general relativity and quantum theory. Are you ready for that this evening? In the beginning of the 20th century, Albert Einstein described in his general theory of relativity, gravity. And relativity in its general form deals with things on the very largest of scales. It deals with galaxies and the universe itself. Around the same time, Niels Bohr and others looked at things on the very smallest of scales, atoms, electrons, protons. And Their quantum theory worked beautifully. General relativity works beautifully. But most of the time, those doing general relativity, doing on very large things, are very separate from those doing quantum theory on very small things. Normally, they're down the other end of the corridor, apart from at one point in the universe's history. Can you guess what that is? 10 to the minus 43 of a second. If you were paying attention, you would have heard that the whole universe is very small. At that point, general relativity says, that's my area. It's very large, the whole universe. Just hold on, says quantum theory. This is my area, it's very small. The trouble is that the two theories don't fit. And that's why people like Professor Hawking and others pursued a quantum theory of gravity to try and bring these two theories together. But so far, we haven't got one. We've been unsuccessful. I said it was frustrating to scientists. And one scientist, Robert Jastrow, wrote, "For the scientist who has lived by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. They have scaled the mountains of ignorance, they're about to conquer the highest peak, and as they pull themselves over the final rock of 10 to the minus 43 of a second, they're greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." Now, I don't believe that, okay? I'll tell you why in a moment. Because this is the type of argument you might have heard down the pub, which goes, the universe began with a big bang. Who lit the blue touch paper? Who set the firework off? That must be God, people say. And indeed, people have used this. Pius XII, Pope Pius XII, and Edward Milne, E.A. Milne, great mathematician, not A.A. Milne, by the way. That's a completely different Milne. E.A. Milne wrote a brilliant book on general relativity. And at the end of his book on general relativity and the expansion of the universe, he said, "The first cause of the universe is left for the reader to insert, but our story is incomplete without him." This is putting God into the 10 to the minus 43 of a second. And I have two problems with this, my friends, and I speak as a Bible-believing Christian. The first is that this is an argument called God of the gaps. If science has a gap in it, the tendency is that we insert God as the explanation into the gap. The trouble is, as science progressively explains more and more of its own area, God is pushed out and becomes irrelevant. Now, the God of the Bible, in terms of sole creator, is not a God who simply lights the blue touch paper of the Big Bang and then goes off for a cup of coffee, not to have anything more to do with the universe. The God described in the Bible in the New Testament in Hebrews is the one who holds the universe in the palm of his hand. The God of the Bible is described in Paul's letter to the Colossians is not a God who smashes a champagne bottle against the hull of the universe, pushes it out to sea and says, "Cheerio, folks, see you on Judgment Day." God is the one who keeps the whole thing afloat. So that Paul writes, "In him all things hold together." The Christian understanding of the Creator is not one who intervenes at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, but the one who sustains every moment of the universe's history over 13.8 billion years. So beware of a God of the gaps is the first thing. The second is the problem of what a great neuroscientist called Donald Mackay called nothing buttery. And Professor Mackay used to say, beware of the scientist who says, "I've got a scientific story, it's nothing but that." And people like Professor Richard Dawkins will say, once I've got a theory of evolution, once I've got a scientific description, that's all I need. With respect, I think that's just too simplistic. After all, let me use a silly illustration. What is a kiss? A kiss is the approach of two pairs of lips, the reciprocal transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes, and the juxtaposition of two orbicular muscles in a state of contraction. That is a kiss in scientific terms. But if I go to my wife, Alison, when I get back tomorrow or Thursday or whenever it is, and I say to her, darling, let's get together for a mutual transmission of carbon dioxide and microbes. Let me juxtapose my orbicular muscle in a state of contraction with yours. She would say, get lost. You see, in that context with my wife, the carbon dioxide and stuff is true, but it's not sufficient. To fully understand a kiss, I have to talk about meaning, purpose, value. Now, which is the true definition of a kiss? Is it the one about carbon dioxide and microbes, or is it the one about meaning, purpose, value, love? Actually, both are true, but different. So the scientific description of how God sustains the development of the universe does not have to be held as the only but or nothing but story. For Genesis 1 is saying, at the origin of the universe is not an impersonal mathematical theory, but a personal God. That's the first point. The second point is this from Genesis. God is the sustainer of order in the universe. This is done by the number of words in Hebrew. So if you count various terms and various verses in Genesis 1, you will find the number 21, 35, 7, 14 appearing. You don't have to be a great mathematician to know that those are all divisible by 7. And the number 7 to the Hebrew speaks of beauty and order. So in the very way the literature is being written, there's a sense of this is a God of order. In fact, if you look at Genesis 1, it begins with the earth was shapeless and empty. Day 1, day 2, day 3, about the giving of shape to the universe by separation. Day 4, day 5, day 6 are about the filling up of the shape. Day 7, everything's completed. God rests. Now, order, for me as a scientist, is very important. I was speaking with one of my colleagues just last week. He builds universes in vast Cray supercomputers in the basement of the cosmology department in Durham. He has these huge universe simulations. You just need a few basic laws and a little bit of gas and huge computing power to do it. And he said to me, David, he's not a person of faith. He said, the thing that strikes me time and time again is, where do the laws of physics come from? Where does the order in the universe come from? A number of historians of science have pointed out that it was the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave to science its philosophical basis by which we do science. Because the universe is created, you had to look at the universe, the importance of observation. Because God was a God of order, you would expect there regularities or laws. Because we were made in the image of God, we could understand that order. Because there was one God, those laws would be universal. The same law that means my 7-iron doesn't travel a very long way, but the ball comes back to Earth, is the same law that actually operates around a black hole. Slightly more fiery around a black hole than my 7-iron, but it's the law of gravity. Why is the laws universal? And because there was no fear of the gods of nature, people could do and be encouraged to do experiments. Christianity, in its Western European form, gave birth to the rise of modern science. And, well, that's intriguing. Albert Einstein once said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. You've got to think about that for a moment. I mean, why are we here, the centre of Edinburgh, on a Tuesday evening, talking about the universe back to 10 to the minus 43 of a second? And it's intelligible. Well, I hope it's intelligible to you. Why should that be? John Polkinghorne, who was particle physicist at the Cavendish in Cambridge, said, because God is the source of both the mathematics of our minds and the mathematics of the universe. not a proof of the existence of God. But the God of order is the source of the physical laws. And that means, by the way, just as an aside, those of you who are scientists, engineers, technologists here, those of you who are studying science, those who use science, I believe that that's a Christian vocation. That you can only do it because God has put order within the universe. Now, in some churches, I'm sure this isn't one of them, there's a kind of hierarchy of how holy people are. You know, the ministers, the clergy are the most holy, aren't they? They're the ones who are really following God's leading. Then you come down to those who work in medical services, doctors and nurses. They're pretty holy, but not as holy as the clergy. You come down a bit. Then often at the bottom of the pile are the scientists and the accountants. No, says Scripture. Those who are scientists, technologists, and engineers, we thank God for you because you're exploring the order that God has put into the universe. And that's a Christian vocation. You still with me? I've only got another 2 hours to go, I promise. Third, God is the source of extravagance, says Genesis. That's why tonight I've not read the whole passage, because actually we wouldn't have time. Because the writer gets more and more excited about the extravagance and diversity in the universe. Let's just go to the James Webb Telescope for a moment. When James Webb Telescope was put into orbit, these were the first pictures that were released. Nature ran an editorial with astronomers are in awe of these. Well, astronomers are mostly in awe about these things. This was the first picture. This is a deep field of galaxies. Don't worry about these stars in the foreground. They're not particularly interesting, by the way. I want you to look at some of these little blobs here. These are galaxies, typically containing 100 billion stars. How many galaxies are there in the universe? Well, about 100 billion. I know it's late at night, but I've asked you how many stars are there in the universe. Very simple sum. 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies. Multiply 100 billion by 100 billion, and the answer is a lot. Something like the grains of sand on the beaches of the world. That's the vastness of the universe. And some of these galaxies, oh, by the way, do you see the kind of arc pattern of some of these galaxies? That's due to gravitational lensing. We haven't got time to go into gravitational lensing, but it's fantastic. But some of those galaxies are so far away that the light has taken 13.4 billion years to reach us. Let me say that again. From some of those galaxies, the light has taken 13.4 billion years to reach us. Now, the light from the sun, which I occasionally see in the northeast of England, takes about 8 minutes to travel from the sun to the northeast of England. The light from some of these galaxies has taken 13.4 billion years. So I'm seeing those galaxies as they were 13.4 billion years ago when the light set off. This is a big universe. The second picture from James Webb was this, and this is a maternity hospital for stars. This is a cloud of molecular hydrogen that will typically form about 10,000 stars as large as our own sun. And galaxies are fun in lots of ways, particularly when they enter Strictly Come Dancing, because this is a cosmic waltz, the third picture from James Webb, of galaxies that are revolving around each other, helped by the force of gravity, in this beautiful cosmic waltz as we observe it. And so the writer of Genesis doesn't see all of this, but you notice the writer of Genesis goes into the extravagance and the diversity of all the different kinds. And my favorite, perhaps one of my favorite verses in the Bible, the great understatement of the Bible, do you see it? He also made the stars. This God is so great. By the way, he also made the 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies, just to give you a sense of perspective. He made the stars also. Diversity and extravagance. I meet people occasionally who've had bad experiences in churches and kind of say, well, church is boring, and they seem to project that onto God. God is not boring. Sometimes you think about God, the creator, as a mathematician. Respect to mathematicians here, I'm a mathematician, but quite a few of us are pretty boring, to be honest, as mathematicians. The picture of God in the first chapter of Genesis is God of the divine artist, who just loves to create, who does so with extravagance and diversity. This is an exciting God to know, says the first chapter of Genesis. And if God creates with diversity, then there's something about us maintaining, sustaining, look after, stewarding, serving the diversity of our creation. Just a couple of years ago, I went to a small funeral service in a Welsh fishing village in a hall smaller than this. And it was for this man, John Horton, who died during COVID. And John Horton is probably one of the most significant Christians of the 20th century, because John Horton, atmospheric physicist, Director General of the Met Office, was the person who brought together over 120 scientists from different nations in the first scientific assessment of climate change, the first IPCC report under John Horton's leadership and chairing. And part of it was because he was concerned as atmospheric physicist about global warming, but part of it was he was passionate about the world that God had created, that he'd been introduced through Jesus to. A man of driven Christian faith to make a difference to the world. And that was the first scientific basis for global warming. I'm nearly finished. God is sole creator, sustainer of order, source of extravagance. And the fascinating thing about Genesis is that God is the seeker of relationship. Now, in the ancient Near East, particularly if you look at the Babylonian myth, Enuma Elish, human beings are created as the servants or slaves of the gods. It's a kind of divine Downton Abbey. The gods are up there, and human beings are the servants. In Genesis, it's very different. Human beings are created in the image of God, and in Genesis 2 and 3, God walks in the garden and talks intimately with human beings. It's a very different model. And I think the question of what it means to be human is one of the big questions of the next decade. So if we find other life forms elsewhere in the universe, what does that mean for our self-understanding as human beings? As artificial intelligence grows, does it become conscious at some point? As I understand my genetic code, and I know that actually I share 67% of my code with cauliflower. You can probably tell that by looking at me. What difference are human? How different are they? What does it mean to be human? It's really interesting that in the first chapter of Genesis, as it's developed in Genesis 2 and 3, to be made in the image of God is not about our physical or intellectual makeup. It's about the gift of relationship, that God wants to be in relationship with us. It's about the sense of responsibility that God gives us to the natural world, allied with that sense of creativity, being made in the image of a creator God. So when it comes to new movements such as artificial intelligence, I'm wanting to ask, how is this used responsibly? Yes, but I'm also wanting to say, how do I thank God for the creativity that's involved in those who are coders, those who are rolling products out? And at the heart of this is, how does it enhance communities in justice and in relationships? To be made in the image of God is not to create a Tower of Babel simply because we want to be more famous than anyone else, or that we want to protect ourselves from everyone else, losing the sense of our dependency on God. To be human is to be called into a relationship with this Creator God. And so, jumping from there, I need to take you right into the New Testament. Because you may be saying, okay, that's all well and good in terms of what Genesis says, and you've talked about how it may relate to science. But you've talked about Big Bang and model and evidence. Where does this knowledge of God come from? Do you just walk through the doors of a church and simply have to believe? You know, schoolboy definition of faith, that faith is believing those things you know aren't true. Is that what Christian faith is like? I became a Christian at the age of 17. And part of that was I fell desperately in love with a girl who went along to the local church. So I went along to the local church. I see some of you did that as well. Not the same girl, I'm sure, but different churches. Shows how old I am. I was into the music of Bob Dylan in a big way. Bob Dylan went through his Christian phase. I suddenly heard about Jesus in my language, my culture. But thirdly, I read the New Testament. I'd never done that before. I just listened to what people told me about the Bible. And as I read the New Testament, there was much of it I didn't understand. But I encountered this man, Jesus. And I could not explain Jesus in any other way than this was God himself walking the space-time history. And this Jesus was calling me into a relationship with God. For John's gospel will put it like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Wonderful kind of philosophical picture of creation. But then John, just a few verses later, will say, and the Word became a human being and lived amongst us, full of grace and truth. For we beheld his glory, glory of the only Son from the Father. No one has ever seen God. The only Son has made him known. That's been true in my life since the age of 17. And it has given me an integrating point, not to look at science and faith in conflict, but to see them in dialogue. I still have lots of questions, which we'll get to in a moment. The questions where my faith questions my science and my science questions my faith, some of which I've not got an answer to, but ultimately those questions have not been destructive, but they've been fruitful and exciting, both for my science and for my Christian faith. Andy, is that enough to get us started? And are we going to have a pause and then go on to questions? But thank you very much.
Yes. Let's thank David. Yeah.